Right, good evening, everybody. They must have changed a function on Teams because they just asked me and checked what language I was talking in. So, and will everyone be talking in the same language? So they've obviously added that to the functions. And I hope some of you had a nice sunny morning and bright morning this morning like we did. As I said in my email that I sent out earlier, it definitely helps the mood. This afternoon we went back into deep fog and mist, which is never as nice. But this evening we've got Liz Jennifer again to talk us through making your land work harder and integrating livestock and arable into your systems. So, as I said last week, for those that were here last week, Liz has a strong technical background and worked with both beef and sheep farmers across the UK. She has knowledge that covers both livestock production, grazing systems, and sustainable farming techniques. She works with farmers who want to challenge their own practice, particularly on grass and forage, and is one of the founders of Carbon Calling, where she's building a community of farmers who support and learn from one another to make their farm and themselves both happier and healthier. She is a mixed farmer in South Lincolnshire herself, and she has an Australian cattle dog called Scout, which if you see Liz around or if Liz comes to your farm ever, she will have Scout there. Just watch your ankles because Scout sometimes likes to nip, as I found out once. So Liz,
it's an honour to be bitten by her. That's what I'm rebranding it as an honour. She's heals. It's not a bite. It's a healer.
Yeah, just making us aware she's there. Liz, do you want to do the questions at the end unless anything's vital to go through as we go through again?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yep.
Yeah, so if anyone's got any queries on any particular slide, just pop it in the chat or raise your hand if you think it's necessary at that time. If not, we'll do the questions at the end. But over to you, Liz.
Just checking it's. So you can see that screen and it's all.
Yep, it's now
good.
full. Brilliant.
Thank you. So good evening, everybody. So yeah, I will be going through this presentation, and it's and the key thing we've got to remember is that none of this is new, and I quite enjoy this quote, and this comes from a book called The Complete Grazier, and this I don't think is even the first edition. So this is from 1893, and the custom of maintaining agricultural holdings that are in almost entirely arable or almost entirely pastoral has failed to meet the necessity of the time. And so I think that is equally as valid now. And so it's just quite useful to remind ourselves that this is not about preaching this is a new system. This is about rediscovering something that has been within the farming community for a long time. So the plan is to, in the next sort of half an hour or so, is to go through the introductions, what role livestock have in arable systems. There's the range of options of how to get involved, and then a brief summary at the end. And the joy with this is there's so many different opportunities and options of what to do. And I'll highlight some examples as we go through in terms of how people are working slightly differently within this. So it gives opportunity to think about joint ventures, working in collaboration, different new entrances coming onto farms, people being given opportunities, such a range. It sort of opens up a range of opportunities. So linking back to, and this came from some questions that came from last week. So I just thought I put in a few slides just at the front to answer, to sort of deal with some of those queries as well. And it fits into this. So I do more and more on systems, which is when we're trying to think about, rather than necessarily focus on an individual topic or hyperfixate on, say, carbon, for want of a better phrase. We're trying to think of it as a whole system. So how does this system function better? Can we make it function better? What we have to recognize is that farms are complex biological systems. So they have loads of, I sometimes use the example of whack-a-mole. So if you hit something, if you smack a mole one way, another one emerges somewhere else. So we have to have this sort of holistic view of what's happening. So what we're always trying to do is match resources, and this is where I suppose arable or livestock and arable systems work, is that we are trying to match those resources better. We're trying to use the livestock as a tool to enhance certain elements within the arable system. We're optimizing inputs. So again, we'll talk through, but there's opportunities when you've got lays or livestock grazing arable areas that we can adjust the inputs that are following those animals just because of nutrient availability. So it gives us an opportunity to think about inputs. And I won't necessarily focus on it this evening, but some people are using sheep generally to graze winter cereals off. So the infamous golden hoof that again has been around for decades, if not hundreds of years. And that's allowing them to actually reduce the fungicide use in the spring. We have to think nutrition, genetics, and health. So how can we try and optimize the nutrition? Have we got the right type of animal trying to achieve this system? And how are we going to try and maintain their health? Infamously, I always use the word trade-off because there's no such thing as perfect. So again, what we'll see when we have sheep grazing cover crops, depending on how those animals are managed, potentially cattle too, we might see some surface compaction. So we have to sort of weigh up the benefits of having those animals on that system, but we might also have consequences. And that depends a bit on soil type, when they're grazing, the weather they're grazing, all of those things. Pinch points, and that comes up quite frequently when talking to arable farmers who want to develop systems, but magically they want all of those animals off by mid-Feb because that's when they want the drills in. So actually, where do those animals go? What can we do to try and avoid these pinch points, which is where we've got conflict between animals, feed supply, and what other jobs are needing to be done on farm. Sometimes people are doing it because they think it's the cool thing to do, but they might not necessarily have the right range of resources or a lot of the time skilled labour. So there is other ways. When we're talking about arable in livestock in arable, we're not always talking about a grazing option, and again we'll talk about that before. So it could be straw for muck deals, it could be growing forage crops on contract. It could be other things. It's not just about grazing. So what's the most appropriate way to get the benefits you're after? Quality of life. A lot of these systems involve a lot of electric fence, and some people don't particularly enjoy that. Holistic context we've talked about. What is this wider vision for the business? And certainly when we're talking about a grazier arable farmer relationship, it's really important that that arable farmer is thinking 2-3 years away, rather than necessarily just trying to make as much money as possible in this season. And then we'll come back to that. So how do we monitor that we're actually achieving what we need to achieve? So this can be linked to livestock and arable. It can be linked to anything we do. It's this idea of we're trying to have a greater overview of what we're trying to achieve, rather than just rush into the next decision. So there is a growing interest of getting livestock and arable rotations. And we'll talk through some of it's to do with spreading risks. So these are the conversations I have. So some people, particularly when cereal price is now getting more volatile, aka lower, and input costs haven't necessarily followed that. So they're thinking of different enterprises coming onto those farms to spread the risk. Pros and cons of that, because sometimes it can actually impact on the arable side, and certainly from a financial perspective, we've just got to monitor the impact it has on that arable side. A lot of people are wanting to achieve it from a soil health perspective, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a second. Dealing with weed pressures. I've got example for about blackgrass in this. Some people it would be, ironically, ryegrass. Sometimes it would be a brome type conversation. So it depends. It's generally a grass weed pressure that a lot of people are trying to deal with. I've got a brief slide to illustrate stock performance benefits, and we talked about it last week as well, which is within England, we have the Sustainable Farming Incentive, and within that, it's been incentivized to put diverse lays, also known as SAM3 or CSAM3 or GS4s, into arable rotation. So that's driven quite a lot of people to change their practice, where they've had a field that's failing, where they've got opportunities to put livestock in. They have put in those sort of diverse lays. I also know someone who is using those diverse lays just purely to produce silage. They're not actually being grazed by livestock, but that silage is being either sold or used within other enterprises. So again, this doesn't always mean that it has to be a grazed animal, but we're obviously biased towards that solution. So in terms of spreading risk, and this is some gross margins for harvest 2025. So we know the king of arable crops is always a winter milling wheat, relatively close by as a winter feed wheat, and then malting spring barley. So anything you're adding value in terms of further processing for human consumption. So we're starting to see a good variation in terms of what that gross margin is. And so some of the arguments that I talk to farmers about is seeing livestock, particularly 2-year lays, as an alternative to some of these break crops, particularly those break crops that aren't necessarily attracting a huge gross margin. And we'll get to a debate of whether or how we add that SFI payment or payments in, but certainly with payments plus effective grazing systems, we can certainly challenge some of these lower end of the gross margins with livestock. And again, when engaging with livestock farmers during this per hectare performance is important for them to cross-check against. So again, we'll give an example from a sheep perspective as how can we get to similar, if not higher, gross margins than these sort of break crops or more specialist crops. And we talked about this last week. So what are the 3 things we need to really focus on to improve soil health? Reducing cultivations, so reducing the time that soil is moved. Diversity of roots, so the photo on my right is trying to illustrate this diversity in terms of rooting depth, but also sward height above the soil, and that has benefits in terms of what's happening under the soil. And also reducing chemical use, which is, I've chosen a highly emotive image. It was better than some of the other ones I could have found. So, and reason why this is not saying thou shalt never do anything involving a chemical ever again, but we know that those chemicals do have an impact from a soil health perspective. So the more that you can reduce it or maybe mitigate those uses with the additions of a carbon source, so it could be a humate or a fulvic acid, then we can start to have less impact on soil health. So again, and there's probably more of them, but they're the 3 ones that we talk about more and more. Again, this links to a conversation we had last week, which is in terms of what is possible from an organic matter perspective. So this graph is actually showing soil organic carbon, so that SOC you can see on the axis on the left-hand side. And that's, if you double it, you generally get organic matter. So 50% of organic matter is generally the actual carbon piece, which is what this graph highlights. But what we're actually really looking for is the trends. So what we generally see as we increase clay content, we increase the amount of organic carbon that those soils can store. And that's partly due to the sites that are available to store some of that. And what you'll also see is generally grassland tends to be tracking higher than arable. So in certain situations, particularly on the drier side, lighter soils, it's not surprising to find soil organic carbon levels of 1, which could be organic matter of 2%. It's even possible to find things that are lower than 2% in terms of organic matter. So we've got a situation where those soils are hungry is a phrase, but also if we're trying to really focus on on soil health, there is no feedstocks for the various soil biologists to get very excited about. So some of the reason why we're interested in more cover crop, more lays going into some of these soils is to actually boost organic matter levels. Yes, to try and kickstart the system again. So some of these soils, it wouldn't be surprising to have no organic matter, so no organic materials being put onto those soils for probably the last 2 to 3 decades. So these are soils that have had a lot of organic matter stripped out, and so some of this is trying to really increase those levels. And how do we do it quickly? Oh wait, sorry. And this also came from last week's, which is how does it keep going up? And we talked about this idea of getting to an equilibrium. So if your practices don't change, you can get to an equilibrium in terms of how much it increases, but then potentially if you go from a set stocking situation to a rotational grazing or a more paddock grazing system, that level might increase again. So I think it's also we can't necessarily limit ourselves to say, well, it will just reach an equilibrium, so let's not try anymore. As we talked about last week, is what we're trying to do is get it at depth. So I've got an example where we're looking at organic carbon levels or organic matter levels in the top 15 centimetres, but also we're trying to see what those levels are like at 50 to 60 centimetres, which is a lot more challenging to measure. So the other thing we've also got to think about from a soil health, and again, some of you would have seen this last week, is that within this soil food web idea, so this is what is happening under the soil. Notice the bit at the bottom, they're not drawn to scale. We have this quite complex food web under the soil, and what we're trying to understand is what's happening on farm. The bit that is interesting and why livestock, and we'll see in a second, are generally embedded into quite a lot of sustainable farming systems, regenerative farming systems, is because they are acting as an inoculant. So within the rumen, they're producing, they have bacteria, they have process, which is also known as protozoa, they'll also have fungi. So they might not be quite all of the right species for what is going to survive on soil. Quite a lot of them are anaerobic or can flick between anaerobic and aerobic. So anaerobic meaning without air. So basically in the rumen, there's no air, so they need to be able to function. But some of them can function in both with air and without. So those ruminants are happily wandering across these fields that are potentially quite biologically dead because of how they've been managed previously. And they're starting to inoculate it with the start of this food web. So the bacteria, the protozoa, and the fungi. And what we're starting to think about, and apologies for the quality of this, I stole it, is that if we get healthy livestock that are sort of interacting with the healthy root and healthy soil, that what's coming out of the animal is then influencing what's happening in the soil. That's then influencing the health of the plant and potentially the product that we're then selling. So it's this holistic view of that we can't see anything that we do in isolation because how it fits into this wider system. So if we've got animals who don't have who are challenged from a health perspective or not as healthy as we'd like, so how is that microbiome being affected, and how is that then affecting what they're eating? I think that for most grass or forage-based systems, we have to be less concerned about this. I think we still need to understand how we fit in terms of what could impact that. So that could be impacted by cultivations, chemical use, all of those things we've talked about. But this idea that we have to think about how is the health of that animal influencing what products are being produced off that land in the future, and obviously the meat that those animals are also producing. And the microbiome idea has come, we talk about it increasingly, but I don't think we tend to still talk about it in isolation of, well, this is what's happening in the animal, this is what's happening in soil, and actually there's this massive interconnection between the two that I don't think we give as much credit to as we should. What we moving back to the question really of the livestock and arable, as I mentioned, grass weeds tend to be a high focus for people of why they're moving fields out of arable into maybe a grass lay or potentially through some cover crops. And so what we generally see is that there's a 78-80% reduction in black grass seed bank every year. And what this tends to tell us is that if you've got a particular blackgrass issue, you need those lays down for a minimum of 2 years, ideally 3 years. And then we have to think about how we cultivate them back, or do we cultivate them back into arable crops? So a point particularly with weed grasses is that we can't, cover crops are generally a bit too short term to really have this impact that we're trying to see, and that's why some people are going into grass lays. And also when we move to a more diverse lay, we don't necessarily have to have ryegrass within it. So if there's a problem with ryegrass on the farm from an arable weed perspective, we can alter the seed mix accordingly. And this is from a AHDP project I was involved in quite a few years ago, but this sort of starts to illustrate the impact of those short-term lays. So this is lamb growth rates. So the number along the bottom is days, and up the y-axis is a proportion of the land crop that went. So the orange line is lambs that were reared on a short-term lay. So this was a high white clover and red clover lay on very clean grazing. So this was showing that about 50% of their lamb crop was sold by around about 90 days. So when we compare it to the one that's in yellow, which is improved pasture and creep feeding, so we can again see the power that is in those, what we can do in terms of stock performance by having those clean lays, potentially high clover lays as well. We can see the benefit in terms of stock performance. And then just nudging back into regenerative for a second, we see it. This is the groundswell tea towel. If anybody's been, might have got a tea towel. So we see livestock integration contained within those 5 principles that they talk about. We've thought about minimizing soil disturbance, living roots, and diversity. If we then look at integrity soils philosophy, they've also got diversity of plants and animals. They do go slightly wider because they don't necessarily have to be farmed animals. It could be a wildlife piece. So obviously some of this, it's just about having diversity of life on top of that soil. And again, this is a understanding ag, so that's a Gate Brown type idea. And then you can see animals are also contained within that, and also from a diversity perspective. So you can see in quite a lot of these, a lot of the roots in from a sustainable or regenerative approaches, livestock and integration of livestock is a key factor. And again, that's what's driving quite a lot of the interest in getting livestock onto these systems. The challenge we have, and this is, that is for sheep. So this is indicating the density. So the darker the number, the higher the number of sheep there are in certain places. So you can see a high density in terms of in the Welsh mountains and also up in the northwest. In the bit that tends to grow quite a lot of the cereals, which is obviously on the eastern side and through the bottom sort of southern half of the Midlands, you can see generally we have fewer sheep. No surprise, it's generally in wheat. This is for cattle. So again, you can see the darker the colour, the higher the density of the cattle. So again, you can see it generally where the hills are is where the livestock is, and where the crops are where the livestock are not. We've got a whole different pattern when we look at then abattoirs in terms of this. A lot of the a lot of the abattoirs also follow where the stock are, so they also tend to be biased towards the west and north. So we have this delightful need for livestock in arable systems, but in those systems we don't, or in those areas we don't necessarily have a huge amount of livestock. And in certain, particularly in the East Anglia, East Midlands, between those areas that are renowned for their wheat production and quality of land, we're seeing some around 20%. It's higher in certain areas of that land being affected by arable weeds, generally as a black grass or a grassweed issue, which is compromising yield. So it's getting quite significant in certain areas. So as mentioned before, this is not just about grazing. So these are some options, again, stolen from an AHDB publication. So we've got options. This is for beef and lamb. It could be for dairy and also pigs. We can get straw for muck deals, where we're working in collaboration with a local arable farmer, where in exchange for the straw for our housing system, they get the muck. And don't ask me how much it is. So some people do it on a straight swap. Some arable farmers want to ensure that it's all of their straw that comes back because of this grassweed issue. So each of those agreements is slightly different. We could be hosting out wintering livestock. So that could be on a cover crop or a specialist forage crop. So again, we could be not necessarily owning those animals, but we could be involved in a grazing agreement. We can be growing forage crops for a local dairy or a local beef farmer. We can be doing, again, next stage on from that is sort of a year-long agreement. Next stage on from that is a grazing agreement, and then we could some of those people are looking at tenancies, particularly important for pig production, and joint ventures are increasing. I'm there's some examples up in Lincolnshire where arable farmers are putting in quite big areas of cover crops through some of the sustainable farming incentives, and then working with people who are owning those livestock to do some contract finishing for them. So again, it's how do we do this balance between not everybody has the capital to buy that number of stock they need. So how can we work in collaboration? So again, I find it interesting in terms of there's loads of different ways of doing it. And I think the other thing I mentioned before, which is some people are also doing it, yes, to make money, but also to give people opportunities. So maybe to build up businesses or provide them different ways of working. So, and some of it is that some of those relationships have to be quite well established. So they might have gone to college together, or their dads or mums might have gone to college together. So a lot of the time it's quite long-term relationships that encourage this people to do collaboration. Sometimes it's not. And that I find interesting in terms of how you get more of these opportunities recognised by people who aren't necessarily in that circle. So back to that question of what are we actually trying to do? So this is the question. So again, this is a very simplistic way of looking at it. So a lot of people are looking at improvements in soil organic carbon. And for me, a cover crop that's in for a relatively small amount of time is not going to make that necessary shift probably in that. It will have a little bit of a benefit, but it's not going to turn around 20-30 years of no organic materials being returned onto that soil. Improvement in soil structure, again, likely to be a more longer term solution, so that could be a diverse lay, and generally we're looking at more than 2 years. Blackgrass we've talked about. When we're thinking about filling forage gaps, again, cover crops or brassicas can do that. But that tends to be when you might have more closer control over the animals that are grazing them. Not necessarily reduced inputs. Again, we're looking probably longer term lays with legumes, improved animal performance lays with legumes. To be fair, the evidence on animal performance on cover crops is not there. A lot of it is anecdotal. So some cover crops are really good for maintaining ewe performance, but not necessarily finishing lambs. And generally, if we're trying to get more and more lambs finished, we do have to have a stubble turnip or some sort of root crop within it to really get that the feed quality up to finish lambs. And some people are in it from a environment scheme and have to do what they said they will do. And that we've certainly seen a drop off of cover crop availability this year because they've changed the SFI, so Sustainable Farming Incentive rules within England, and so that has reduced access to cover crops for certain farmers who have previously relied on that relationship. So that we've definitely seen an impact this winter because of those rule changes. And what we also find is fascinating about ruminants is they are very capable of eating a range of feed, but we have to be really careful about how we manage that transition. So it's about introducing them slowly, never onto hungry stock onto crops, thinking fibre source. And particularly there are some animals that just won't cope, so it could be weight, you're monitoring weights or body condition score. But because the ruminants can eat a range, they've also sometimes are I have quite a lot of conversations from sort of mid-autumn onwards with people sending me photos of fields going, can sheep eat this? Probably. So we have to always look at the proportions of a crop in it, and the common one that we see that doesn't do sheep any favours is buckwheat and linseed. So again, if there's a small proportion of it in a wider mix, then we're less concerned. But it's the only thing they get to eat, then that isn't suitable for grazing. So we do have to think about those mixes. And so just in terms of cover crops, what we tend to see is this extended grazing. So we tend to not see a huge amount of yield, so it can be quite challenging. Generally, is in a very large area on some of these arable systems, but the yield per hectare is not high necessarily, so you do tend to have to keep shifting fences quite a lot. But it is clean land, and again, there's opportunities. It's cheap, and in some situations it's free in terms of accessing it. But generally it's in bare field sites, so no fencing and no water. So again, there's that infrastructure requirement, and it's important to decide who's responsible for that in a grazier arable farmer situation. We've talked about challenging to finish on some of them, and this idea of really understanding when that field needs to be back into an arable production system. So that can sometimes cause conflict. So this is some old-ish work from NIAB TAG. Ironically, what's happened is the cereal price has increased and then it's come back. So actually the grain value per ton is, ironically, isn't that far off. So that is helpful. Bitchy comment, I do apologise. So what we're tending to see from a cover crop perspective is that in that future crop, and again, this is obviously very dependent on cover crop and land quality, but we're tending to hopefully hope for or budget for a 0.5 ton increase in yield in that following crop. So you can again see how that impacts. So we're not off to Barbados anytime soon, but we are starting to see that benefit of some of the faff that is associated with grazing animals on cover crops. And a lot of the farmers, or quite a few of the farmers I work with, are very diligent about moving those stock daily to avoid this risk of compaction. So again, that some of these systems can be quite high labour inputs. If we're thinking about filling forage gaps, which we talked about, again, these cover crops can have an important role in that November, December, January, February time. But again, it depends. The yield will depend on when they were able to be sown after harvest. So again, yield is very dependent on basically how many days of August that seed is in the ground. So the later it's sown, the lower the yield. So I know quite a few systems who take decisions, particularly store lamb finishers, who take decisions on buying in certain batches of animals based on what's in front of them. And so you won't say, well, 1st of September, I'm going to buy 2,000, because we'll just have to see what the forage crops are going to be doing over that time. And also what we learned from 2 years ago in December, where there was that cold snap for 2 weeks, is that don't ever plant all of the same variety across all of the area, because that there was a lot of area that looked really well beginning of December, and by the 1st of January it disappeared. So it massively shifted how and what we were doing in terms of feeding. So diversity of mixtures is also important. So grass lays, I'm slightly biased towards these because I think it's easier to manage from a livestock perspective, because you're not having to sort of move them around to different crops and magically where do they go on middle of February. But we also have to compete with a more formal arable crop. So you can tend to get most arable farmers to do a break crop for a year, but a lot of this is minimum of 2 years is where we're going to start to see this benefit. So there's still this infrastructure requirement, and we still need this more. If it is a grazier arable farmer agreement, we do need a more formal agreement because it is a longer term condition. But generally what we also have to recognise is quite a lot of the fields that are being drilled in either cover crops or grassland have struggled. And the reason why they're coming out of producing winter wheat is because they're not producing it as effectively anymore. So we have to think about that just because we're sowing a grass lay into it, magical things might not happen in that first 3 months. So we still have to get the basics right in terms of soil structure and ensuring that pH and everything is right. We also have to think about, particularly if we're putting diverse lays in, some of those more herby species, so chicory, plantain, etc., do better actually in lower fertility soils. So when we go into generally higher fertility arable soils, we tend to get more grass domination. So we just need to think, we have to be quite thoughtful in terms of what mixtures we're putting in. Questions about infrastructure, how are we going to put that infrastructure in? It was very helpful in the last few years where we had some capital grants to do some of that. Again, they've disappeared for now. Certainly with herbal lays or diverse lays, we have to be really careful about them in the winter. Again, within our mixture selection, if we're keeping it in for longer than 2 to 3 years, how are we going to deal with that herbal content generally drops? But in reality, if we're then cultivating it goes, or it's going back into arable after 2 years, then that's less of a drama. And sometimes we're doing it because we tend to have dry spells in some of these areas, particularly on that east. And what else can we do in terms of ensuring better drought tolerance? We talked a bit about this last week. So again, when we're having these more diverse lays, we need to think about how we graze them differently. They definitely need rotational grazing and they need longer rest periods. And that's mainly to help the persistency of those herbs. And a lot of that comes down to thinking about what species are we managing for. So if we have short rest periods and short grazing, we'll get grass within a year. Just for information, so chicory, when it first sort of came in about 15 or so years ago, the recommendation was to take it to about 30 centimeters and graze it down to 6 to 8 centimeters. So when it's in a diverse mix, it still likes that, but we're not necessarily managing it for that persistency. So again, it's thinking about what's the question, what are we trying to achieve? And generally, the longer that sward height is, the deeper those roots are going. And that's what we're trying to get from those lays to really boost performance in some of these arable fields. So this is some work, again, slight segue, but this is based around a diverse lay. So this is some oldish data now from 2017 and 18, where they had straight ryegrass, so perennial ryegrass, and they're applying 250 kilos a hectare. There was smart grass, which is a type, which was 6 species, biomix, which is 12 species, and herbal, which is 18 species. So quite a lot of our now diverse lays would be sitting between this sort of smart grass and biomix level. So, and importantly, none of these smart grass, biomix, or herbal were any nitrogen fertilizer was being applied. So it wasn't yielding the same as with the high levels of nitrogen. It wasn't too far off. So we saw a 15% or so reduction in yields, but we obviously had a big saving in terms of nitrogen application. 2018 was a dry year, so you could see that all the yields came back, but actually the proportion that the ryegrass struggled within that dry year was higher than the others, so it had a little bit more resilience in that dry year, and also you're still applying less nitrogen. So again, this is back to this input. So the more diverse we have, the more legumes we have, the more resilient we are in terms of a dry year, and also we generally need less nitrogen. But we can still use nitrogen in these systems depending on what scheme you're on, just to necessarily boost at certain times of year if it's needed. But the dream should be they should be yielding without that additional need for nitrogen. This is a project that was again done by HDB a few years ago, and this was the results after 3 years. So an arable field taken out arable, put into a grass, quite a grassy clover lay after 3 years, and then ADAS was involved in this, and they measured before and after. They also did some measurements throughout that, but they basically saw that the topsoil organic matter increased by 6 tons a hectare in that top 15 centimeters. Earthworm numbers increased by 6%, and biomass tripled. So there was a lot more older worms under that system. And this was always compared with a control, which was a continuous arable field that was sort of next door. They found a 0.7 ton increase after that grass clover lay, and obviously they'd already got the benefits of the beef being finished on that lay as well, and silage production. And there was some benefits in terms of black grass heads after the lay. It wasn't necessarily cured, but it was reduced after that lay came out. We focused a bit on herbal lays or diverse lays, and what we can see here is we've got other options. So white clover is an old favourite and is very versatile and can be used in various situations. We've also got red clover, which is increasingly being used, particularly in diverse lays. Forgot to say the considerations. We just need to make sure careful grazing is You might also starting to be seeing more and more annual clovers, so they could be potentially in cover crops, but also being put in to some lays to sort of give that initial boost of production in year one, but then tend to disappear quite readily afterwards. All of that, and as said there, they're more tolerant of poorer soil, so again can be quite interesting within a mix. Subterranean clover is massively popular in Australia and New Zealand, and particularly good in this dryland production system. It's starting to come over here, so there's some varieties available now here, but still not huge amounts is grown. But because it's relatively short growing, so can have a real benefit in a range of systems, and could again being investigated for sort of a living mulch under those under the arable system. So you sort of take it out of your lay, but actually that clover is maintained as you go back into arable and contributing towards some of that nitrogen requirement. Lucerne, I'm really interested in pure stands of lucerne. We don't see much of that now, purely because everyone's tending to put things in diverse lays that can be really important from a silage and grazing perspective, particularly on very dry places. Vetch, again, more and more people using it potentially with oats and other species within that cover crop, but it is only an annual, so it does disappear. Produces a huge amount, looks amazing, but does disappear quite quickly. And then more and more interest in beans, peas, and vetches, not necessarily for taking through to combining, but maybe as a bi-crop or even a tri-crop silage, maybe with barley, and in certain places that's the alternative to maize. And because it's going in as a bi-crop or tri-crop, we can reflect the harvest date will be earlier, which means that we can get cover crops or arable forage crops in afterwards. So it sort of helps that winter production as well. So that can be quite some nice systems based around some of these. So for me, the joy of all of this is that you've got so many options. You're having to introduce new seeds, so we have loads of new seeds that we can introduce. So some of it is making sure we're asking the right questions. Is it the appropriate thing? And a lot of people are trying different things and working out what's for them. There is a couple of examples, just particularly when we're putting white clover into arable fields that haven't really had any organic materials or livestock in, is that we sometimes have to be quite careful that there is actually some rhizobial bacteria. So the rhizobial bacteria is actually what creates the symbiotic relationship within that nodule. So if you dig up a clover plant, you'll hopefully see this pink nodule on the root, and that is inoculated by this rhizobial. So sometimes what we see in very long-term arable fields is that we sometimes need to put an inoculant on even white clover. It's quite familiar for people who've grown lucerne, is that we always have to inoculate for the lucerne bacteria, just because it's not generally in the UK. What white clover normally would be. But again, if those soils haven't been exposed to our livestock, biologically quite challenged, then sometimes it's useful to do an inoculant. So this is just to highlight in terms of where we were looking in terms of gross margins earlier. So we know the king or queen of arable production is always wheat at the top. So we're talking about 1,000 to 900 pounds per hectare. And again, this is predictions for 2025. So I know a sheep system that is adding value through selling breeding stock and also has various payments coming in, so SFI equivalents, and they're just getting over nearly £1,000 a hectare gross margin off a sheep system. That is like remembering the big fish, I know, but just because sheep and beef have always been the slightly poor relation, with really, really well designed systems, high stocking rates, we can be achieving good margins. So that I suppose to be less ambitious, perhaps, that can we compete with arable? I think the answer is yes. But if we're assuming they might be getting, for those fields that are struggling, we might be getting £150 a hectare less in terms of some of those gross margins. So can livestock reeling £500 per hectare gross margin, which is similar, if better than some of those break crops or more specialist crops. And this is just how do we start to think about that. So This is output per ewe. So the blue bars are £50 a ewe, which is quite a low gross margin now for ewes, particularly where lamb price is at the moment. And then this is stocking rate, so 8, 10, 12, 14. And generally what we see where we've got stocking rates of between 10 to 12 ewes per hectare, we're not having to put huge amounts of supplementation in. When we start to push to 14 in a lot of traditional systems, we are starting to see need for a bit more cost coming in. But generally, we're seeing, particularly with these decent gross margins being produced from ewes at the moment, we are able we can compete with some of those arable crops, particularly those on fields that are struggling. And in some areas, some of those break crops can't be grown because of pest issues. So last few slides for me. So top tips, if you're the grazier, and again, I do quite a lot of these sorts of people who are trying to negotiate with arable farmers. So some of them are quite negative sort of arable farmers. And the idea is just because they grow crops doesn't mean they don't necessarily know about crops for livestock. So I deal with still quite a few people who the arable farmer has put grass in, so just rang up someone and said we need this much grass, and it happens to be Italian ryegrass or something, but it basically just isn't the right grass for the job. So this sort of knowledge of what certain grasses will and won't do isn't always there. Particularly for cover crops, it's useful to try and get involved before they're drilled. So again, influencing what those mixtures are and trying to avoid the things that high levels of or any real buckwheat or linseed going in. And we tend to think, I'm also interested in arable farmers who have a longer term plan for those fields. They know they're not necessarily going to get all of the benefit in that first 6 months. And that they also value the skills of that person bringing the livestock in. Infrastructure, I've talked, and that's a lot of the time electric fencing, bowsers is the only real way of doing it. Again, being really clear about objectives, and a lot of this is about when do the sheep need to go off, and the same could be said for cattle. But to have this honest and respectful conversation really early on, and just to keep checking in with people to know, and also what the expectation is in terms of how well grazed. Some people want more green cover left than others. This rumen adaptation is important, so we generally work on 2 to 3 weeks to adjust to new forages. So just think about that in terms of planning rotation. So if you've only got enough crop for that group for 2 weeks, is it the right thing to move them to? Because they've changed that diet and then they'll change again. And again, health is quite important, particularly trace elements. And a couple of considerations, and again, we're seeing quite a lot of arable farmers reducing the amount of arable farming they're doing because of their community engagement with schemes, and some of that is the diverse lays, some of it's AB, some of it's also to do with legume fallow and various things. But the challenge is that machinery cost is then having to be spread across fewer acres or hectares. And also, how do you include that scheme income? Do you put it into each enterprise, or do you put it into the general farm pot? Some of this is a noble thing to do, that we all like seeing more animals in these fields. They're doing a good thing, hopefully in terms of soil health, but how are we going to actually monitor that? So you've seen some examples of earthworm counts, or is it a simple digging hole, taking some photos before, during, and after to see what's happening? And again, with new ways of collecting yield from a combine perspective, again, we can see what's happening from that perspective. I've also seen systems that are, because they want livestock in them, become very complicated because they also want to grow a range of different crops. So you end up with these sort of 8 to 10 year rotations, which are very noble, however, can be quite complex to manage, and potentially you've only got one field of each crop every year. So just think about how does it fit together as a wider system, and try and keep it as simple as possible. And then for me, I think in the next few years, there's an opportunity for, in certain areas, for the livestock maybe not to be paid to turn up, but as a service. But in certain areas, I don't think it's that far off. So actually, to have the skills and to have the animals, all of a sudden we're going to be in demand. That's the theory. That's me done.
Thank you very much, Liz. There is one question which was asked, which says, does chicory die if it flowers, Liz?
No. So it is a perennial. So the theory could be that depending on what weather's happened, is it would set seed, and you might get new plants from that seed. But that, as the plant, it'll chuck up a massive seed head, and it might not do very much for the rest of the season, but it doesn't die away, and potentially that seed some of it could be viable.
I found out that from my lawn when we did an event once, and I shook the thing out of a boot of the car, and then I had chicory in my lawn. It wasn't quite so ideal, but yeah, it didn't. It did keep coming.
Yeah, and chicory is I think, as we mentioned last week, in some farms they really struggle to get rid of it once they've got it established, while other farms it just doesn't get going. So it's a bit not quite marmitey, but and also if you're silaging, it can be quite challenging within a silage situation, just because it puts up this really thick stem that can cause problems from piercing through wrap.
Okay, has anybody else got any questions? You can either use the raise your hand function or type them in the chat. There must be some more questions for Liz. Well, she likes a tough question. Has nobody else got a question? Surely there must be a question somewhere.
I suppose a question we could ask.
I was just going to say, how have some of your other clients that you've worked with integrated this, Liz? As I guess there's probably every different type of relationship with neighbours or other farmers if they've needed livestock on the systems.
Yeah, and the entry drug is always store lambs generally. So in terms of, because they're quite easy you can shift the numbers quite simply. That's generally a place where a lot of those arable farmers would start. But the big question sort of highlighted throughout is actually having people who know how to look after sheep in these big areas where, there isn't always the skills that we need. So, and I know there's a lot of arrangements with people sending store lambs into the east, and then they'll check them and stuff and rely on sort of local shepherding. But there is a bit of a skill shortage in some of those areas.
Okay, thank you. James.
And abattoirs. There's no abattoirs in the east. Sheep.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to moan about chicory, really, because we've been trying to grow herbal lays for some time on GS4 and SAM3, and the chicory is just impossible to manage. I mean, it's very the most important part of our herbal lay is still the grass, because that's what we get most of our performance out of. So to manage the grass properly, you're not really managing the herbs ideally, because like you say, you need to extend the grazing round, by which time chicory has bolted and become completely unpalatable, and the grass has gone past its best as well. So what we're doing now is we're not including chicory. We get on well with ribgrass.
Plantain.
Plantain, but yeah, chicory is very challenging. It looks nice in a drought. It's like nice blue flowers and keeps everything looking a bit green. But every time we put because we have a dairy as well as the sheep, and every time we put the cows into the herbal lay with the chicory in it, the milk goes down. So it's just an absolute no-no for us.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of people are sort of almost choosing similar to you, which is just they've experienced it, that it doesn't fit with their system, and so they just don't drill it.
I mean, we sort of need herbs that are more compatible with how we manage the grass grazing, if that's possible. And there are so many different herbs available but that's really what we need to then to have a herbal ley that you have to then manage differently within a rotation. We're losing too much production from the grass because we're not grazing the grass at the optimum level.
So that if we think back to what those herbal leys are trying to replicate is those diverse permanent pastures. And so what the challenge becomes is that we have really aggressive modern bred grasses with herbs that have been selected from all sorts of places. And remember, a lot of this is not, there is science behind some of it, but a lot of it is driven by government policy where people are, isn't it lovely that we'll have some diversity?
Yeah.
But in reality, most farms, if they weren't being paid for herbal leys, they wouldn't have them.
I mean,
And they would they'd go back to a clover grass ley because it's easy to manage. You can still get good performance off it.
Yeah, I mean, that's yeah. So we would have been managing our grazing platform for the cows and for the sheep where we're not on the hill ground, but on the cultivatable land. We're putting it in long-term white clover leys, and then we were putting in herbal leys before we turned to GS4 and now SAM3 with the SFI. So we did want to do it, but with our experience of it is not the best, and it's a shame. But you know, we need to. I can see that it probably works better with beef cattle, but for the dairy, where we need to get the best performance out of the grass, it's a real struggle to do it with maintain the herbs within the lane. And I'm very concerned also about we put a huge amount of our land into SAM3 and the herbs are not lasting beyond the first year. And so I'm very worried that we'll get an inspection and there'll be any herbs there.
Yeah, and that's again a common challenge. And that's in that winter grazing can be a factor, or again, it's how you fit it into within that system, which is a longer, not necessarily do longer rest periods all the way through the year, but at one point just do a very long rest period. That can sometimes help. So but I agree that they do work really well when you've got some sucker cows in the system, which you can force them to go and tidy it up.
Yeah.
Thanks, James. Crosby.
Yes, hi Liz.
Hello.
Liz, well, obviously from your map you showed Northern Ireland quite the dark brown, so the arable grazing really is a small part in Northern Ireland. You need to be near some, but I've really been talking about the plantain and the chicory added to the grass seed. We've been doing it now for about 6 years, and to be fair, the chicory is disappearing, the plantain's hanging on, and would be overseeding to bring the plantain and the other products into line. The question I was asking you were showing it 6 to 6.5. We're sort of finding on the trial plots that we've been using the various trial farms, we needed at least 6.4 to get the clover to work right, especially the red clover, but certainly the white clover is doing a lot better with that 6.4, 6.67 range. Would you be finding that, or what?
I think that it's a balancing act between, if you've got high lime soils, it's the cost of getting up. If you're sitting around 6, the cost of getting to 6.7 to try and achieve that clover level can be quite challenging. If you've got soils that are naturally sitting at that 6.4 to 6.7, to put a little bit more lime on to encourage clover is interesting. It's just it's sometimes for certain systems it's too much of a jump from where their natural pH would be.
Okay. Any of the guys
another thing is also thinking about other trace elements for clover. So I mentioned that rhizobial bacteria. That relationship is also very driven by manganese. So that it's also having a bit of an understanding. Is I go to farms, you go, well, I have to put manganese on my arable crops, but we're not putting in our grassland. So we also have to have a bit of a think about trace element requirements for some of them, and that's minimal amounts really.
Okay, I know the red clover has been tried out by quite a few of the guys, and Sam said he's got a crop that's lasted 7 years, but the pH is up near 7, and that's the only reason he thinks it's making him through to that stage. Sorry, thank you, Liz.
Thanks,
And it's
Crosby.
interesting. And I'd certainly mentioned briefly lucerne, which is like my favourite, well, 5th favourite plant perhaps, and that really loves high pH. So
But that
that's
would
where,
need it. That needs drier ground though, or the heavy clay would be too. Yeah.
But I think it's the principles of those more legumes. I mean, they like
Yeah.
high calcium. It's not necessarily the pH is part of it, but I think it's the high calcium requirements which they're obviously getting from those high lime soils.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Crosby. I'll come to you in a second, Richard. I'm just going to ask the one that was in the chat just before your hand went up. What reference documents are there, Liz, to share with arable farmers the benefits of manure muck swap for straw and the benefits beyond nitrogen? They're struggling to get people to do swaps, and could it get even harder if they ban autumn spreading?
So in terms of it's not on the top of my head, but I can ask someone, and again I'll send it to Katie. So I know they're in the process of DEFRA funding the update of a thing called Manna NPK, which is all about understanding the value of organic matter, but obviously from an NP and K perspective. But there'll also be some work in terms of what impact it has in terms of organic carbon, but they're not in my head, but I can find out who. And yeah, the autumn spreading is, I mean, we had the disaster that was there, that introduction a couple of years ago. So yeah, there's always a threat of that, or particularly in certain areas with particular safeguarding zones around water extraction. So that isn't helpful. I don't know how to answer that. Yes, it's a challenge.
And I'll have a look, Emma. I'm not sure whether there's possibly an AHDB document that may give some information on that as well. I'll have a look, see if that is still available. Richard.
Yeah, hi. I'm just thinking of, well, I am going to be putting in some herbal lays this spring. The reason is partly to, well, mainly to act as a break crop within our arable system, and also to provide some much needed weed control against blackgrass, and also to provide some additional grazing and forage grazing for the sheep in the later summer. So what I'm thinking is putting in a timothy-based grass mix with the herbs, and as you know, maximum production is not the key requirement I'm after. Just wanted to see what Liz thought to that.
Rich, can I just ask, whereabouts are you, rainfall wise?
In East Midlands, around Milton Keynes.
Okay, so yeah,
so
the Timothy
we're on Hanslope Boulder clay soil, so fairly high pH, a lot of them.
Yeah, so Timothy is a really nice idea. Depending on, I generally also would, I like a bit of cocksfoot, particularly on dry places, albeit I know you're on clay land in a dry place. But you've just got to, it's to do with how you're then grazing it. If you're not going to graze it potentially until later in the summer, both of those grasses can get quite tall and stemmy. Think of, Timothy is used a lot for horse hay production. So it's just making sure that you can keep on top of them. But that it's like any grasses, you just got to try and keep it vegetative for the autumn.
Yeah, if we needed to, we would probably silage it or top it or something, mow it for hay possibly, if we had, surplus production that we couldn't graze.
Yeah, and I work with a guy over in Norfolk who's convinced his seeds person to pull down the grass proportion within that diverse lay as much as he possibly can, and so as a more grazing option. So that is a lot more herbal, but there's still a bit of grass in there for ground cover and weed suppression. But that's probably, it might be too sort of, it might not be the place to start, but certainly there's people playing around with the different proportions, because a lot of the time It's what the grass wants to do and what the herbs want to do is the conflict. So we're trying to either pull the grass down or put more or put less productive grasses in, so they're equal. They're a bit more equal, really.
Yeah, yeah. So if we needed to, if the grass was getting away and the herbs were sort of lying in the understory a bit, if we went through with a topper and took the top of the grasses out, as long as they didn't leave a sort of mulch that smothered everything, that might be a way to control it, possibly.
Yeah, it's an opportunity. Or if you did a silage cut off it, and you took quite a lot of the bulk of the grass off sort of May, June time, then particularly in your bit of the world, those herbs would start to dominate because the grass growth would start to drop post that point because it tends to dry up. That's the other way of getting more herbs through as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Has anybody else got any other questions for Liz this evening? Doesn't look like there's any other hands coming up. Were you just about to say something, Liz? Or
no, I just thought of someone who would, Lizzie Sagoo, who you'll know, Katie. She could be a good person to get on the chat at some point, just from the manure question. So, because she's done quite a lot of the work on, in the background on manures, or her and her team, or she might nominate other people, but they've done a lot of work on making best use of manures. But anyway, I realised I was about to say it, and I was like, I'll just send her an email, and then you asked me, so I've told you.
I could see your lips about to move.
But
yeah, no, thank you, Liz. I'll have a look at that for a future meeting. And thank you, Liz, for sharing your knowledge this evening. Obviously, if anybody has any questions that you think of after this evening, I'm sure you can drop Liz an email or drop them to me, and I'll pass them on to Liz. And next week we have Mike Powley is on the call, sharing boosting herd performance using homegrown feeds and forage, and just sharing with you really his story of what he's doing on his farm up in Yorkshire. So if you haven't let me know already that you want to join that, then obviously just drop me a line and I'll send you the details for that. And I will send the recording, as I usually do, obviously afterwards, but you guys have been here, so you probably don't need it anyway. But no, thank you again, Liz, for sharing your knowledge, and we will catch up again with everybody else next week, hopefully. So thanks again, and hope you have a nice rest of your evening. Thanks, guys.
Thanks very much.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thanks, Dave. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.